Hi everyone, so this is going to be the first of a bunch of theory videos that myself and Leanne will be doing, and I thought for the first one we'll stick to the fundamentals of learning theory, which is how dogs or any other animal learns. So there are two main categories that I want to talk about today, the first being classical conditioning and the second being operant conditioning. The word conditioning essentially just means training. And classical conditioning is all about building associations, whereas operant conditioning is learning that every action has a consequence. So in classical conditioning, as I said, it's all about forming associations, and this is involuntary a lot of the time, so it's all done on the subconscious layer of the brain. The person that came up with this you've probably already heard of without even realising it, and that is Pavlov, who did the Pavlov's dog experiment. And for those of you that may not have come across that, Pavlov essentially had loads of dogs, and every time he was about to feed them, he would just ring a bell. And over time, he noticed that he could ring the bell and the dogs would start to expect food. So that would be a salivation response. So every time they heard a bell, they would salivate, which is involuntary. I don't know about you, but have you ever tried to control your saliva? Because it's not possible. And that's because it's all done under the radar. It doesn't even come into our consciousness. So that's how he worked out what classical conditioning was. So just to put it into perspective, this is what we do when we start our feeding procedure. So when we introduce the whistle at feeding times, we're essentially linking a neutral stimulus, which is the whistle, means nothing to the dog at that point, with something really, really positive, which is its meal. It loves its meal, really high value, really satisfying, really fulfilling. So every time that dog is listening to that whistle, then all of a sudden, he's no longer just going, oh, what is that? Don't really care. He's going to go, oh, what's that? Food's coming, I'm so excited. And that's why then when we use it for a recall, we blow the whistle and straight away the ears prick up and they go, I know what that means, and come charging back into you, waiting for their food. That's why it's really important to always pair the whistle with something, because otherwise we start looking at extinction, which is something for another video. So it is all about changing the emotional response. And by that I mean we can take something unknown to the dog and make it suddenly either positive or negative, depending on what we pair it with for that association. Equally, we could take something that is perceived as positive or negative to the dog already and flip it based on what we associate it with. So, for example, you may have heard myself or Leanne go on about counter conditioning. Or whenever we've advised you to sit and watch something, this is what we're aiming towards. So counter conditioning is essentially changing the emotional response that the dog is having towards a certain thing. So say they'd never seen a horse before and they were slightly on edge about it. What we'd say for your first experience with a horse is let them look at it. And every time they look at it, you're going to swiftly deliver something really tasty or play a game with them, something that's really fun that they're going to really appreciate. So they're then seeing this potentially really scary stimulus and going, oh, that means food, or that means playtime, something really good is about to happen to me. So then what you get in the future is they see the horse or the unknown stimulus and they just go, oh, good things are happening. And it gets that really nice process ticking along in their brain. So that horse or whatever it is has suddenly become really nice for them and they start to really like it. The thing to remember about this though is that your timing is absolutely crucial. So it always has to be unknown stimulus and then the fun thing. Because then what you're getting is you're changing the response to the unknown, because then they're expecting something. If you give them the fun thing before they've clocked the unknown stimulus, you're actually devaluing the fun thing. Because then whenever they're faced with the fun thing, they're going to take a step back and go, why are you giving this to me? What is there out here that I need to be worried about? What is there that's new in this environment? And suddenly you're changing the meaning of the peanut butter bone. So it always should be unknown stimulus, so new thing, then the fun thing. And hopefully then we can get a really nice positive association going on in classical conditioning. So the next one is operant conditioning. So this is learning that every action has a consequence. It's all based on a little 2x2 table, which I'll pop just up here. And it's based on positive and negative, as well as reinforcement and punishment. So the positive and negative doesn't mean what we usually take it to mean in this sense. It's used in the scientific sense. So positive means adding something into the equation, whereas negative means you're taking something away from it. And then you've got reinforcement, which means that you're increasing the chances of that behaviour happening again, so that behaviour is going to happen more often. And you've got punishment, which means you're decreasing the chance of that behaviour happening, which means that that behaviour hopefully will suddenly or gradually stop over time. So looking at the table, we're going to start with positive reinforcement. It's the one that we use all the time. And that's adding something into the equation that's going to increase the chances of whatever just happened happening again. So that's treats, it's playtime, it's giving a cuddle, vocal praise, all of the good stuff like that. And that's the really important quadrant. We'll talk more about it later, but it's really good for building confidence in a dog, as well as really nurturing the bond between handler and dog, which means that you get much better responses in the future. Again, we'll come on to that later. Then you've got negative reinforcement, which means you're taking something out of the situation that's increasing the chances of that behaviour happening again. So this is what we use when, say, we're using a halty head collar. You also see it in horse riding, where you are applying a pressure, and then once the behaviour has been performed, you're then releasing the pressure. So say in horse riding, if you want the horse to turn right, you apply pressure to the right rein, and that brings the head around. Once that pressure releases and that thing has been taken away, they have turned right and they go, oh, okay, that meant turn right, and the pressure goes away. It doesn't always have to be aversives like that. In fact, I definitely say if you use that area of the quadrant, we don't use aversives. We don't use aversive training at guide dogs. So the next one is positive punishment. So this is adding something into the equation that will decrease the chances of the behaviour happening. So you find this in your really typical aversive training methods. So shock collars, prong collars, choke collars, martingale collars, all of that kind of thing. If you've ever seen Cesar Millan, it's the alpha roll, that kind of thing. It's an aversive, painful experience most of the time that changes the dog. And it is a lot of the time based on fear, which is why we want to avoid it, because it can lead to massive confidence issues. And that's when you get a really anxious dog that's probably more likely to lash out. There are ways to use that area of the quadrant a lot more sophisticatedly, but we can talk about that later on a one-on-one basis if one of those techniques is what's going to work for that dog. But again, it's always non-aversive, force-free, which means that we can really harness and nurture the confidence in the dog. Then your final piece of the quadrant is negative punishment, which means that you're taking something out of the equation, which means that the behaviour is going to peter out. So, for example, when you've had baby puppies and they're having their mad 5 minutes of just mouthing everything that moves, and you're going, I really can't deal with you anymore. And myself or Leanne will have said, okay, take yourself out of the equation, pop out the room for 2 minutes, wait for them to calm down, and then come back in. That's negative punishment. We've taken you out of the equation. You're something fun. So we've removed you. And then that behaviour that got you up to that point of the excessive mouthing is going to slowly peter out. Because you repeat that over time and they learn the more that they get into that mouthiness, the more often you're going to leave, and they don't want you to leave. So that's how that works. You can do the same with toys, taking away things in the house. But again, that has to be done with a lot of caution because it can lead to other issues. The main one we use is taking you away. So again, if you have any questions about that, drop me a line below or drop me an email or a text and we can discuss that a little bit further. Another note with operant conditioning, like I mentioned, it means that every action leads to a consequence. But equally, to get the best learning that you can, you want to be setting your dog up for success. And that means thinking about what we call the ABCs. So the A means antecedent, which is setting up your environment. So for example, if you know that your dog's really tired and likely to jump up, you maybe say, okay, well, I might not have a visitor because they're likely to jump up at the visitors. Instead, you might say, okay, well, I know that 10 a.m. is a really good time because Fido's come down from the breakfast high and is quite calmly pootling about, got some good concentration, so we could work on training then. So maybe invite the visitors around then. Or, for example, if you're looking at chewing the furniture, then you might want to start cordoning off bits of the house that is going to be really tempting, especially skirting boards. We all know they love a good chomp on a skirting board, but providing lots of good stimulation items for chewing, such as bones, teething toys, rubber toys, that kind of a thing that gets that chew energy out of them whilst being appropriate. So that's what the antecedent means. The behaviour is obviously the action that the dog takes in that situation. So say it was, I don't know, let's talk about house training. So say they decided to pee in the spending area. The consequence to that would be us praising them and going, yeah, well done, giving them those praise, that praise and those treats that we always do for house training in the early days. But say they toileted in the house, because they've done the exact same behaviour but in a different antecedent environment, the consequence changes, and instead they don't get anything, it's just completely ignored. So that consequence then is not exactly desirable, it's not aversive, but it's not great. So what they're learning in between there is that taking that behaviour in one context will get them really great stuff, doing that behaviour in a different context, not so much. If we take another example, so say the step procedure. Your antecedent, when you're first building up to that, is going to be making sure you're right next to some stairs, so you're making it really nice and easy, that you can say it almost as you're guiding the dog in, so that they can't get it wrong, really. And like I say, building your dog up for success. Then you get the behaviour, so them indicating the bottom step, so front feet go up on the step. And then the consequences of that is us praising them. So again, it's always looking for that praise, that's the positive reinforcement. So hopefully that makes sense. Always think about your antecedents, what behaviour you're looking for, what the consequence is going to be. Out of your consequences, try and stick to that positive reinforcement as much as possible. If you want to discuss the other bits of the quadrant, then we definitely can, because there are definitely other training methods in there that are really good. And don't forget about your classical conditioning. So Leanne's going to be uploading a video soon on the use of sound CDs, for example. And that's what to bear in mind at the back of your head when she's talking to you about sound CDs and what that timing means. So like I mentioned before, if you have any questions about any of that, give me a shout or give Leanne a shout and we'll be happy to talk you through it. Also, I will be uploading some scans and some handouts of various bits of information if you want to read a little bit more about it as well. So I hope that was informative for most of you, if not all of you, and that you enjoyed it, and there'll be more to come soon. Thanks very much. Bye.